What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're going to be talking about movement in this ridiculous rules breakdown video. Today we're going to be doing a real quick rundown of the basic rules that govern how movement works, as well as the specific types of movement that can occur throughout a turn. Now, movement describes your model's traversal across the battlefield, and while it normally occurs within the movement phase, and a lot of the rules governing movement are within the movement phase, not all movement occurs in that phase. Now, when it comes to moving your models within your movement phase, what you'll do is you'll select a unit, select a type of movement for them to perform, execute that movement, and then move on to the next. There are a couple specific types of movement that can occur during the movement phase at this stage, but these movements can also, thanks to special abilities or stratagems, be executed in other phases. However, they're still going to be using the same rules. I'll break down the kinds of moves that you can choose to execute when you are within the movement phase, but first what I want to do is talk about some of the basic rules that are in play for all types of movement. Now, with some exceptions that we'll discuss later, movement is always measured horizontally across the battlefield, and while it can be stopped at any point to change your direction, the distance that each of those legs of your trip take must still be deducted from the total that you are allowed to move. Each time you measure for this movement, you measure from the part of a model's base or hull, whichever it uses for measurement. So in case of Bellicor here, he is a monster with a base, meaning that he uses his base for measurement, or for this Space Marine Land Raider, that is a non-based vehicle, meaning it uses its hull for measurement. And when a model like that moves, you measure the furthest distance traveled by a unit during that move. Now, while a unit is moving, they can change their direction and pivot at any point. However, you must keep in mind that because part of their base or hull is moving, in that case, you still have to measure the distance traveled by that portion. So, for example, if I wanted to move Bellicor over to this area, and what we're going to do is actually give him a copy here in order to measure this accurately, but rotate him to get line of sight or potentially block line of sight from his model, we still have to measure the rotation that the base undergoes while it's making that movement. Because if we look at, let's say we'll use this little guy's sword as a reference point, that is going to move farther than just if we measured the distance moved by the base itself, by about 2 inches. Meaning that a move like this, where Bellicor is moving and rotating, will cost me about 10 inches of movement, even though my actual distance is only traversed about 7.5. While the outstretched wings and other components of Bellicor don't measure for measuring movements, they do count for line of sight. So in some cases, you do want to be able to pay that movement to rotate the model in order to change its position on the table so that you can get more effective line of sight for yourself. Now, in most cases, that movement cannot take a model over enemy models, nor can the movement take a model's base or hull, whichever it uses for its measurement surface, off the edge of the battlefield. So while outstretched parts of a model can hang off of the battlefield, the base or hull will still stop when it would collide with the battlefield edge while trying to make that movement. You can also, each time you move one of your models, move it through other friendly models, with the restriction that both the moving model and the model being moved through do not share the monster or vehicle keywords. So in this instance, for example, this Termagant could move through the Hive Tyrant here, and any of these other infantry models can be moved through the Hive Tyrant as long as they don't end on top of its base. However, a Hive Tyrant could not move through another friendly Hive Tyrant. However, like I mentioned before, in almost every instance, you cannot move through enemy models. Now, an important thing to note before we move too far forward is the relationship between movement and terrain. Movement is always horizontal traversal across the battlefield, and terrain will typically block that traversal. As we'll talk about later, there are several ways that models can be moved up and over terrain features, but without having any special rules, terrain features will impede your movement. Models are also allowed to move vertically in order to traverse terrain features. Now, while many of the terrain features used in 40k are ruined terrain types, so many unit types like beasts or infantry can move through them without penalty, larger models like this Land Raider are not able to move through the vertical elements of this ruined terrain. However, any model can move up and down a terrain feature, so you could potentially pay 3 inches of movement to move up, and then you would have to pay 3 inches of movement to move down the other side of this wall, meaning that if this Land Raider was advancing, for example, and moved a total of 16 inches, paying 3 inches each way to go up and down this wall, it could potentially traverse that wall. This is different for units with fly, which use the through the air movement rules. Now, I explained these in more depth in my terrain video, but essentially through the air movement allows the model, instead of moving up to a terrain feature and moving vertically in order to climb it, it allows them to move diagonally to the top of that terrain feature. So in this case, if Bellicor wanted to move to this position, he would only have to pay 14 inches of movement, getting a little bit of a discount by being able to measure his movement diagonally when going over that ruin wall. Now that said, models can move over terrain features that are 2 inches or less in height. Now this is a little bit confusing because a terrain feature describes the entire miniature being used to represent this terrain. So in instances like this building, where we have a shallow wall that is attached to a larger 6-inch ruin, this would actually be a 6-inch tall terrain feature. So a model could not move freely through this ruin. However, they can move through this one because this is no greater than 2 inches at any point, meaning that as long as they can clear the vertical elements of that terrain feature, they are good to go with that movement.
I should also note that some specific events or event formats house rule this terrain rule so that individual elements of a terrain feature that are 2 inches or less in height will not impede movement. That is technically a house rule and not supported by the core rules, but it is important to check if you're playing in an organized play event whether or not they're using this rule.
You are also required to end any movement within unit coherency. If you ever attempt to not do so, for example, if we were to move these termagants this way while moving, unfortunately, that move would be illegal and all of the models in the move return back to their previous positions. You can have some instances where models are killed to a point where they are no longer able to establish coherency with their moves. In cases like that, those models are not able to move at all. They simply stand there and wait for the end of turn coherency check. However, if you are at any point able to move into coherency with your move, you must do so. You aren't allowed to end any moves outside of coherency voluntarily. Now, those are the rules that govern any kind of movement in any phase, whether it's in the fight phase, in the charge phase, in the movement phase, or when using a reactive effect like a stratagem or an ability during your opponent's turn. All of these movements are typically comprised of one of the movement types in the game, and that is what we're going to talk about now. Now, as I mentioned before, some unit types are used during the movement phase when you select a unit to move. However, these will oftentimes be used elsewhere, and when you use them in other phases, the normal rules that govern both all movement and those moves themselves still apply. Now, these types of movement used in the movement phase are remaining stationary. This is actually kind of a misnomer. It's a type of movement you can do when you are selected to move, but you don't go anywhere. You just stand still and move 0 inches. This can be performed even if you're engaged and basically means that your unit stands still. It will give you some benefits. For example, heavy weapons give you a benefit when your unit remains stationary, but it should be noted that remaining stationary is a specific choice that you make during the movement phase. It doesn't just describe not moving. You have to declare that your unit remains stationary in order to get the benefits of anything that triggers on remaining stationary.
This is especially pertinent for effects that could come into play on your opponent's turn. Even though your models haven't moved during that turn, you haven't had a movement phase, so you haven't taken the remain stationary movement. So effects like the Born Soldier's lethal hits, for example, will not come into play unless it is your own turn and those units have specifically selected remain stationary during your movement step.
Normal moves are moves that travel up to your movement value. These cannot move into engagement range of enemies but have no other special rules. It's important to note as well that even moves that could potentially cause you to travel farther than your movement value stop at the end of your movement value. So for example, if you have an ability that says you can move 8 inches in response to an enemy effect, but your unit is only move 6, you can only move 6 of that 8 inches. You're still restricted by your movement characteristic for the total distance of that move. Advances are movements of d6 plus your movement value. That d6 is an advance roll and is rolled at the beginning of that advance when you declare that you're going to make it. They cannot enter engagement, and they prevent that unit from shooting or charging at all for the remainder of the turn after they're completed. Fallback moves are a special type of moves that can typically only be performed when you are are engaged. Normal moves and advances, however, cannot, which is what distinguishes fallback moves. When you fall back, you can travel up to your movement value and can move through an engagement range, can move through enemy models, which makes this type of movement unique, provided you don't end that movement engaging enemy models. If you would complete that movement engaging any enemies, like moving out of coherency, it simply means that the fallback move is illegal and reverts the unit back to its original position. This makes it possible to escape enemy units that are surrounding you by moving through them, as long as you can clear their engagement range, but it does require that you take a desperate escape check. Desperate escape checks are special checks that are rolled when units fall back while battle shocked or fall back over enemy models. When you take a desperate escape check, you roll 1d6 for each model in the battle shocked unit, or if you're falling back over enemies, you roll 1d6 for each model that is moving over the enemy. For each result of a 1 or a 2 on that roll, the controlling player chooses one model from the unit to be destroyed. It doesn't take mortal wounds, it doesn't take damage, it's just completely dead, meaning that you could potentially lose big tanks or titans from desperate escape checks, but you choose the model in the unit that dies, meaning that if you have a character, for example, that has to move over an enemy with a fallback move, and you roll a 1 or a 2 for your desperate escape check, you could choose a different model in the unit, not the character, to be destroyed instead of them. It's a bit of a common misconception, but there's also no penalty for falling back both over enemy units and while you're battle shocked. You only ever take one desperate escape check when falling back. It doesn't even make the chest more dangerous to pass. And it should also be noted that you can use command reroll to reroll failed desperate escape checks. However, if you're battle shocked, you can't use command reroll to affect the unit, meaning that you couldn't use it in that instance. Now let's talk about the types of movement that occur in other phases, the most important one being charges. Charges occur after a successful charge roll, and I have a whole video about charging and fight phase movements that I will direct you to here. You move 2d6 inches, or the result of your charge roll, towards the charge target, and if your models can get into base contact, they must do so. You can also enter engagement range of the charge target, but you cannot enter the engagement range of any other units. It is important to note that you always must be taking this movement towards the charge target. The distance between the moving models and the target has to be closer, even if you're not moving your full charge distance. Piling in is a 3-inch move towards the nearest enemy model, as long as your unit that is piling in can engage them. This happens at the beginning of your fight activation. However, if you can move into base contact with this 3-inch movement, you must do so. But if your unit cannot engage any other units with the pile-in move, they do not make a pile-in move at all. Similarly, consolidation happens at the end of your fight phase activation and moves 3 inches towards the nearest model, just like piling in, if you can engage an enemy unit at the end of that movement. However, if you cannot, you instead can move 3 inches towards the nearest objective marker, as long as you can move into the control range, or 3 inches from the 40mm marker of that objective marker. Now, obviously, it's important to note that all of the basic rules that we talked about at the beginning of the video, paying rotational movement, moving over terrain, and moving through friendly models, as long as you are both not monsters or vehicles, all apply when making these types of movements. Those come into play anytime you move. Now, flying models have specific interactions with movements. When flying models make normal moves, advances, and charge moves, they can move over enemy models. You can always move over enemy models when you fall back, so they don't get any special treatment there, but flying models don't have to automatically take a desperate escape check if they move through enemy models while falling back. Instead, they would only have to take one if they're battle shocked in doing so. They also can use through the air movement anytime they're moving, including when they're making charge rolls. However, that movement over enemy models only comes into play in the specific types of movement that I described earlier, only during normal moves, advances, and charges. You cannot do so when using other types of movement like piling in or consolidating. And with that, those are all the movement rules for Warhammer 40k. I hope this cleared things up. I saw a lot of questions over the last few weeks about how movement works and some of the idiosyncrasies and specifics of that movement, and I hope this video helps you out. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are amazing, and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.